Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 2, The Annexation of Bosnia. When the Emperor Francis Joseph looked back over his long life, he grieved that the Habsburg monarchy should have lost the fair Italian provinces during his reign. The wish for some compensating gain lay deep in his heart. This was not unknown to Ehrenthal, who became the foreign minister in 1906. Ehrenthal, like Conrad, brooded over the growing dangers which beset the empire. He hoped by dexterous diplomacy to revive its strength and gratify his master. After the Russo-Turkish War of 1878, the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, liberated from the Turks, had been placed in the care of Austria by the Congress of Berlin. Footnote: in the future, Bosnia and Herzegovina will be mentioned as Bosnia. End of footnote. For 30 years they had been ruled from Vienna under a mandate of the signatory powers which amounted to sovereignty in all but name. Formally, however, they were still part of the Sultan's dominions. The arrangement had worked fairly well. The Sultan had ceased to mourn his loss, and Europe had come to regard the provinces as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This tranquility was disturbed by the Young Turk Revolution. A government appeared in Turkey, modernist, nationalist, and aggressive. The whole of the Balkans and all countries intimately concerned with Turkey were forced to review their position. If the Young Turks succeeded in reviving their decadent empire and Turkey became a strong power, might she not reclaim her rights in more than one direction? Hitherto, Bosnia had enjoyed paternal rule. But if Turkey established even only in appearance a parliamentary constitution, would it not be argued that her former provinces in Austrian charge would certainly require institutions upon at least the same level? Bulgaria, though in fact independent, was also like Egypt, a tributary province of the Turkish Empire. Prince Ferdinand had long cherished the hope of becoming a king and of proclaiming the independence of Bulgaria. He too saw in the change in the character of Turkey both the need and the occasion for self-assertion. All these issues came to a head in the autumn of 1908. The misfortunes of Russia in her war with Japan had reawakened the Russian feelings about the Dardanelles. If the Russian Black Sea Fleet had not been prevented by Article 29 of the Treaty of Berlin from passing out through the straits, they could have joined Admiral Rozhdestvensky in his tragic voyage to the Sea of Japan. And the Russian argument, erroneous but sincere, was that the Battle of Tsushima might then have had a different ending. When therefore Ehrenthal began to sound Russia upon the revision of Article 25, which dealt with Bosnia, it seemed that both empires might derive satisfaction from modifications of the famous treaty. In neither case was the issue of much practical importance. Austria already had the provinces, and both the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles had been heavily fortified by Turkey. There was, however, open to both powers the prospect of a sentimental gain. Austria had rendered a service to Germany at Algeciras. She had been, in the Kaiser's dangerous words, the faithful second on the dueling ground. Might not she expect in her turn assistance in the gratifying of her own desires? During the summer of 1908, Ehrenthal addressed himself to the Russian foreign minister Izvolsky, and more than one secret conversation took place between them. Izvolsky, a tall, fine-looking Russian, was not a particularly wary negotiator. In principle, he was well disposed to Ehrenthal's ambitions and ready to discuss a plan whereby Russia would not obstruct the Austrian annexation of Bosnia, provided that Austria in return supported Russia in obtaining the right of passage for her Black Sea warships through the straits. The Austrian ambassador in St. Petersburg, Count Berchtold, was naturally in the center of these affairs. He arranged a meeting between Ehrenthal and Izvolsky at his chateau at Buchlau in September 1908. It was an important occasion for both the guests and their host. A friendly talk, a great chance for Ehrenthal. Here was the foreign minister of the one power of all others likely to be offended by what he wanted to do. Here he was, in good will and in good faith, ready to talk it all over like one man of the world to another. One may blame Izvolsky for treating upon these grave matters with a lack of caution in a general and easy-going manner. When men speak for mighty nations, they cannot always make the conversation smooth and agreeable. But far more must we blame Ehrenthal. He conceded nothing to the fair play of the world. He took every advantage. He exploited every admission and even every courtesy. He left Izvolsky under the impression that they were both working together, and the next day sold him up before the whole world. There is one set of rules for people who meet as declared opponents to argue, to bargain, or if needs be, to strike. There is another set for gentlemen talking in a friendly way about matters in which they seek to collaborate. Here lay the offense of Ehrenthal. It was a grave offense. It has definitely restricted the intercourse of nations. Every diplomat should study this story in its minute detail. But the moral that will be drawn is one which reduces the facilities of understanding between men and states. The conversations ended. The Buchlau visit was over. Izvolsky went upon his holidays, and Ehrenthal returned to Vienna. He returned to Vienna with the feeling that he had involved the Russian sufficiently to compromise his obstructive power, and that Russia anyhow would not make serious trouble about the annexation. He prepared his dossier carefully. He loaded up his press. He told the Emperor that Russia had consented and flung the annexation of Bosnia out upon the world. It was a bombshell. Every chancellery in Europe recognized it as an aggressive act done in an ill-conditioned manner. Germany, who had been told nothing, was astonished, but did not withhold her support from her ally. France was cynical, Italy surprised, Russia was indignant, Turkey offended, Serbia in a frenzy, and England deeply shocked. To his very vitals, Sir Edward Grey was outraged. All his cherished principles were challenged. The Whig statesman, the monitor of the public law of Europe, the English gentleman and public schoolboy, all these elements in his powerful character were equally affronted. A treaty had been broken. International instruments signed by many states had been set aside by one or possibly by two. The position of the other signatories was affected. They had a right to be consulted and to express their view. A little oblivious, perhaps, of some newly turned pages in our own history, he took with confidence and even relish the highest line. The Kaiser's official comment upon the event leaves nothing to be said by others. It is a striking example of how little justice or merits counted in German pre-war politics. Ehrenthal's performance comes to look more and more like a subaltern's rag. He told us nothing about it, gave Izvolsky and Titoni such veiled hints that they regard themselves as entirely bamboozled, showed the Sultan, who is principally concerned, no consideration at all. He has thrust the appearance of connivance with Ferdinand, the breaker of treaties and of peace, on his master, brought the Serbs to boiling point, irritated Montenegro to the utmost, instigated the Cretans to revolt, thrown our Turkish policy, the outcome of 20 years' hard work, on the scrap heap, exasperated the English and promoted them to our place in Stambul, infuriated the Greeks by his friendliness towards the Bulgarians, smashed the Treaty of Berlin into smithereens, and thrown the concert of the powers into the most unholy state of discord, annoyed the Hungarians because Bosnia was to have been incorporated with them, made the Croats furious because they had designs on the incorporation of Bosnia with themselves, That performance, viewed as a whole, is a European record such as no other diplomatist has ever put to his credit. He certainly is not a far-seeing statesman. This did not prevent the whole force of Germany being exerted in Ehrenthals' support. The new doctrine had become, my ally, right or wrong. Europe now entered upon the second of the three grave crises which were the prelude to Armageddon. England, supported by France and Russia, proposed a conference of all the signatory powers to review the Treaty of Berlin, and at first Austria and Germany agreed. The dispute was then transferred to the subjects to be raised. Austria declared that the annexation itself was settled beyond recall and could not be discussed. Many objections were found to the Russian desire to open the Dardanelles to her warships. Turkey claimed effective compensation. Months passed and the tension grew. The Turks organized a most injurious boycott of Austrian goods. The War of Pigs began between Austria and Serbia, and the price of bacon throughout the dual monarchy was nearly doubled. Gray's righteous censures bitterly offended Vienna. The sharpest conversations occurred between the British ambassador and Ehrenthal. "You are responsible," exclaimed Ehrenthal, "for all this trouble." "Surely it was not we," replied the ambassador, "who annexed Bosnia in violation of the Treaty of Berlin." This retort incensed Ehrenthal so much that he fell back upon abuse of the British conduct towards the Boers, which our representative could only remark was irrelevant to the point at issue. The Tsar showed himself profoundly discouraged and depressed. Marchenko has given a vivid account of his audience at St. Petersburg. "I have there," said the Tsar, pointing to his writing table, "quite a lot of letters from the old man, the emperor, but all are nothing but falsehood and deceit." Izvolsky became Ehrenthal's mortal enemy, hurried to Paris and London to express his wrongs. Serbian fury mounted steadily. Their future, they declared, had been blighted by a violent and unlawful breach of an international instrument, which, if it were ever to be changed, should reunite them and their kith and kin in Bosnia. Popular demonstrations, challenging speeches, and considerable military activity continued in Belgrade. The Austrian preparations were upon a formidable scale. The three army corps opposite the Serbian frontier were raised to almost their war strength. Night after night, large numbers of troops passed stealthily through Vienna on their way to the south. A strong development of Austrian forces became apparent opposite Russia in Galicia. Meanwhile, diplomacy argued about the agenda of the conference, and the newspapers, particularly in London and Vienna, carried on a wordy strife. So the winter passed. In March, the relations between Austria and Serbia were at the breaking point, and a frontier incident of any kind would have caused war. This grave word now crept into the dispatches of all the capitals. If Austria invaded Serbia, Europe would be set on fire, and where would the conflagration stop? Could the Tsar, however peacefully inclined himself, however unready his army, hold back the popular surge in Russia, which the chastisement of Serbia at Austria's law-breaking hands would certainly evoke? If Russia marched or was marched upon, what would Germany do? And France? The relations of the various alliances were limited on paper by important conditions. Germany was not bound to support Austria in an aggressive war, nor was France pledged to Russia in a quarrel which did not involve Germany. But the ties between Austria and Germany had grown stronger since the Algeciras Conference, and since the friendship of the Kaiser and the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. No one could feel any assurance that Germany would be anxious to find a technical excuse for not standing by her faithful ally. An alarming incident, which had occurred between the French and Germans at Casablanca, might serve as a ready pretext for widening the area of the struggle in harmony with what were believed to be the German military plans for a war on two fronts. Clemenceau ruled in France, and his conduct in these anxious weeks showed an iron composure. But it was certain that no direct challenge would be lightly offered to France while he sat there. Sir Edward Grey had from the outset made it clear that Great Britain would not go beyond diplomatic action upon the dispute in the Near East. He declined absolutely to discuss what action Great Britain would take if the general European catastrophe occurred. In fact, he made the same sort of moves as he was afterwards to repeat in July 1914. This was the strongest policy open to him, for neither the Cabinet nor Parliament would have tolerated any decided declaration. For this reason, as we reread the correspondence of this period, it may perhaps be argued that Great Britain sought to play rather too prominent a part upon a stage which had become so deadly. If we were not prepared to run the same risks as the other actors, ought we not to have stood more aloof? But all his action was loyal and skillful, and aimed only at peace and parley and the patient assertion of treaties. In those days the two armed groups into which Europe was divided had not yet become camps. Neither the Triple Alliance nor the Triple Entente, as the term ran, were knit together as they afterwards became, nor were they united upon the questions at stake. Great Britain, though resolute to support Russia diplomatically, was not enthusiastic about opening the straits. Italy thought more of her antagonisms against Austria than of her membership of the Triple Alliance. France maintained an attitude of impenetrable reserve. But we may be sure that the most fateful contingencies were not those which were least present in the minds of her political and military chiefs. When we study this long-drawn crisis with after-knowledge, we see how near Europe was to the abyss into which she was to plunge 6 years later. In March, Ehrenthal demanded of Serbia that she should cease her warlike preparations and forthwith publicly recognize the annexation of Bosnia. Serbia, encouraged by Russian sympathy and to some extent by the countenance which Great Britain had given to her complaints, was by no means willing to submit. Nothing, it was said in Belgrade, could annihilate the Serbian race. Invasion, conquest were lesser evils than the repudiation of its destiny. It was at this moment that Germany struck. On March 22, Count Pourtalès, the German ambassador in St. Petersburg, handed a brief written communication to Izvolsky, couched in urgent and peremptory terms. Unless Russia immediately recognized the annexation of Bosnia and persuaded Serbia to do likewise, Germany would let Austria loose upon Serbia, and a war would follow, in which Germany would sustain her ally to any extent that might be necessary. Izvolsky, thunderstruck, hesitated to speak. "Very well," said the German, "then it will be war." Izvolsky on this said he would consult his colleagues and the Tsar. The Russian Council of State sat for 4 hours that same day. In the evening Russia submitted unconditionally to the German demand. She did not even consult with France or England. The Tsar and his ministers believed probably, with good reason, that even a day's delay would be fatal. They saw themselves about to be attacked and invaded by Germany and Austria. Their army was still recovering from the disasters of the Manchurian campaigns. The revolutionary movement which had shaken the throne and the Russian state had scarcely subsided. This was no time to stand on dignity. 5 years before, France had dismissed Delcassé in the same dire plight. Now Russia, in her turn, must answer the stern Teuton summons: obey or fight. Russia obeyed. When on the 25th a similar request, somewhat differently framed, was made by Germany to Sir Edward Grey in London, he handed the German ambassador, Count Metternich, the following brief memorandum upon which the Liberal cabinet had agreed. The assurance of a readiness to accept Baron Derenthal's declaration respecting the annexation at a future conference affects only one of the various questions which have been raised by the action of Austria last autumn. At the present moment, His Majesty's government are deeply interested in the preservation of the peace of Europe, and therefore in a settlement of the Serbian crisis in particular. The assurance for which the German government asked while involving all alteration of the Treaty of Berlin leaves the Serbian question unsettled and makes no provision for the solution of other questions relating to the Treaty of Berlin in which England and the other European powers are equally interested. His Majesty's government are not disposed to give the assurance required until the Serbian question has been settled in a pacific manner on lines satisfactory to them and the other powers and until a solution has been assured of other questions arising from the annexation of Bosnia by Austria, especially the alteration of Article 29. When this result has been obtained, His Majesty's government will be ready to agree to any peaceful settlement based on mutual goodwill amongst the powers. Metternich read the paper with surprise and deepening gloom. "This is a very grave decision," he said, "which imperils peace." "I replied," said Grey, "that this could only mean that Austria intended to attack Serbia, or to dictate terms to her, if we did not do what Austria asked. The British government would never consent to act under pressure of this kind." Thus, for the first time, the opposing wills of Germany and Great Britain met squarely. The two governments seemed to look into each other's eyes. A silence followed. This action was taken by Great Britain with the knowledge of the Russian collapse, and without seeking aid from France. Girt with the sea and her naval supremacy, as yet unchallenged, she could afford to preserve her self-respect, if need be, in isolation. She was not in the cage with the eagles. Nonetheless, all resistance to the wishes of the Teutonic allies was at an end. Sir Edward Grey could do no more than arrange the form of reply which Serbia would have to make to the Austrian demand in terms as little wounding to Serbia as possible. It was only with difficulty that Ehrenthal was induced to allow Serbia to include the phrase, "sure of the peaceful intentions of Austria-Hungary. Serbia will bring her army back to the condition of the spring of 1908. He was anxious that it should be clear to all that she had submitted under duress. With this concession Serbia had to be content. She formally declared that she abandoned all protest against the annexation of Bosnia and promised to live with Austria-Hungary in the future as a good neighbor. A convention was also drawn up between Bulgaria and Turkey, in which Turkey recognized the independence of Bulgaria. All the great powers thereupon signified their agreement unconditionally to the modification of Article 25 of the Treaty of Berlin and recognized the annexation of Bosnia. No satisfaction of any kind was provided for Russia from Article 29. She was left to ponder upon events. Izvolsky, deeply humiliated before Europe and blamed by his countrymen for exposing Russia to the worst rebuff she had suffered in living memory in time of peace, was only sustained by the indulgence of the Tsar, and that only for a time. In 1910 he quitted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and became ambassador in Paris. Here also he had a part to play. Ehrenthal's triumph was thus complete. Sir Arthur Nicholson, British ambassador at St. Petersburg, writing while the impression of the Russian submission was strong upon him, said, "After this easy victory I should not be surprised if greater demands were made of Russia. My firm opinion is that both Germany and Austria are carrying out a line of policy and action carefully prepared and thought out. Algeciras had to be revenged. The ring broken through and the triple intent dissipated. The Franco-Russian alliance has not borne the test. and the Anglo-Russian intent is not sufficiently strong or sufficiently deep-rooted to have any appreciable influence. The hegemony of the Central Powers will be established in Europe, and England will be isolated. The activity in building up the German navy is significant, and the sudden entry of Germany on the scene here is also significant. When we have passed through the present Sturm und Drang period, I should not be surprised if we were to find both France and Russia gravitating rapidly towards the Central Powers, as neither of the former, distrustful of each other, feels that she can stand alone against the power of the central combination. The ultimate aims of Germany surely are, without doubt, to obtain the preponderance on the continent of Europe, and when she is strong enough, and apparently she is making very strenuous efforts to become so, she will enter on a contest with us for maritime supremacy. In past times we have had to fight Holland, Spain, and France for this supremacy, and personally I am convinced that sooner or later we shall have to repeat the same struggle with Germany. Such were the reflections of this eminent and accomplished diplomatist, soon after to become the head of the British Foreign Office. They were surely serious conclusions to spring from the trumpery change involved in converting Austria's sovereignty of Bosnia from fact into form. For all the evils brought to the structure of European peace by this episode, Ehrenthal was alone to blame. He could have gained his point in all probability without serious friction. He could have carried Izvolsky with him if he had treated him with ordinary consideration, or even good faith. His craft and ineptitude had made his victory dear bought. Some of the reactions expected by Nicholson were not to occur. Russia considered that she had a powerful friend to gain in Britain. The relations of the two countries became more intimate. The reorganization and expansion of the Russian army proceeded, and her strategic railways, fed by French loans, grew steadily. The Tsar undertook a journey of state to Italy by a route which, in spite of pressing invitations, meticulously avoided setting foot upon Austrian soil. His meeting with the King of Italy at Racconigi proclaimed that common interests existed between the two countries. Germany persevered with ever-increasing energy in her plan of building a fleet of which the strongest navy in the world should stand in awe. And Great Britain, after some internal disputing, laid in the single year of 1909 the keels of no less than 8 dreadnought battleships, unsurpassed for size and power. During that year the naval rivalry and its consequent tension between Germany and Great Britain became the dominant fact in Europe. The cleavage in the structure of Europe were no longer even concealed. Italy became noticeably detached from the Central Empires. Germany and Austria drew more tightly together, and France, Russia, and Great Britain began to be united by individual injuries and common dangers.